What if your greatest quality was the reason for your downfall? Imagine that your honesty, your precision, your unique and meticulous way of seeing the world was exactly what led you to lose everything. Think about it for a moment. The irony is cruel, isn't it? Before we dive deep into this story, I'd like to know which city you're watching us from right now. It's always nice to feel closer. What you're about to hear is the journey of a young man who was brutally punished for being brilliant. But what happened after his truth escaped the walls that tried to silence it is something that no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted. Subscribe to our channel right now, because every detail of this story will hook you in a way that you won't be able to leave. Michael's room was his sanctuary, his refuge from the noisy chaos of the outside world. There, every object had a place, a logic, a piece. The physics and math books weren't just paper and ink, they were loyal friends, lined up, in an order that calmed his mind. The walls, covered with post-it notes with complex equations and meticulous notes, were the map of his private universe. But that night, the silence in the room did not bring peace. He screamed. A high-pitched cry of injustice echoed in his head. He sat on the edge of his bed, the expulsion letter on his desk, and replayed the scene over and over and over again. The advanced astrophysics class, the amphitheater packed with 200 students. On stage, Professor Alistair Vance, a legend in the department, a man whose reputation preceded him. He spoke with unquestionable authority about the formation of supernovas, drawing complex equations on the whiteboard. And then Michael saw it. A mistake. A small detail in the decay constant. A number that seemed insignificant to most, but which, to Michael's mind, catastrophically altered the entire result. To him, it was like watching an architect build a skyscraper on a cracked foundation. He didn't raise his hand to challenge, to humiliate, or to show off. He raised his hand because in his world, truth and accuracy were sacred. The information was incorrect, and his brain couldn't just ignore it. It was as natural an impulse as breathing. His voice, when the professor finally gave him the floor, was calm, almost shy, but firm. "Professor Vance, with all due respect, the decay constant you are using in the equation is outdated. A study published last month in the Astrophysical Journal by a team from MIT revised that value. The correct value would be..." He couldn't even finish his sentence. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, dense. Professor Vance's face, once a portrait of academic confidence, turned into a mask of fury and humiliation. Being corrected, in public, by a student. For the professor, this was not an academic contribution. It was a personal affront, an act of insubordination that could not go unpunished. The humiliation of being reprimanded in front of everyone hurt Michael, but nothing compared to the cold, cutting pain of the injustice that unfolded in the days that followed. He didn't attack a man, he just tried to correct a fact. But the institution didn't see it that way. The system, that gigantic, impersonal machine, moved to protect its star, its renowned professor, and not the neurodivergent student who only wanted science to be right. In that quiet room, Michael felt like an exile, a stranger in his own world, punished for speaking the only language he truly mastered, that of logic, that of truth. And for the first time he asked himself, with genuine pain, is there any place in this world where a mind like mine is not seen as a defect, an offense, or a threat? The first reaction of Elena, Michael's mother, was the protective fury of a lioness. She had not raised her son, overcoming so many obstacles, to see him crushed by a vain system. With the determination of someone who moves mountains, she scheduled a meeting with the university president. They entered an opulent room with heavy dark wood furniture that seemed designed to suck all the light and hope out of anyone who entered. The president, a man with a polished smile and eyes that revealed nothing, greeted them with calculated cordiality. He spoke in circles, using corporate jargon that served only to confuse and disarm. "We need to understand the full context," he said. "Professor Vance has an impeccable career. He is a pillar of this institution." And then came the phrase that made Elena's stomach churn. "You know, sometimes how we say things is much more important than what we actually say." The message was clear. The truth about her son was inconvenient. The solution they proposed was, in fact, an insult disguised as conciliation. They suggested that Michael write a letter of apology to Professor Vance. It would be for his own good, so he can learn to navigate complex social environments, the principal concluded, with an air of offering the wisest of solutions. Apologize for being right? It was like asking a bird to apologize for having wings. It was asking Michael to deny the essence of who he was. The false hope didn't stop there. Friends of the family, with the best of intentions, offered advice that was like little knives stuck in an open wound. He needs to learn to control himself a little, said one. In the real world, you can't go around saying everything you think. You have to be flexible, advised another. They couldn't understand. For Michael, withholding information he knew to be correct was physically painful, like trying to hold back a violent sneeze, a convulsion of the mind. The university then delivered its final blow, disguised as help. The solution to avoid immediate expulsion was a one-semester suspension, accompanied by a mandatory course on interpersonal communication skills. It was a clear punishment, disguised as a learning opportunity. It was the institution screaming in silence. The problem is not our professor with a fragile ego. The problem is you, your brain, the way you are. The hope that logic and justice would prevail slowly died in that dark room, replaced by the painful and cruel realization that the adult world was not about facts but about power games, appearances, and fragile egos. With every door closed, every piece of empty advice, Michael's sanctuary became a prison, and his isolation, once a choice, was now a sentence. The storm that formed at the university soon invaded Michael's home, and the tension inside could be cut with a knife. Stefan, his father, was a practical man, an engineer who believed in hard work and adapting to the rules of the game. He loved his son deeply, but he always struggled to understand how Michael's mind worked. For Stefan, the diagnosis of autism was a label he preferred to ignore, hoping that, with time, his son would simply adjust. The news of his expulsion was the last straw. "I told you, Elena," he exploded one night in the kitchen, his voice heavy with years of frustration and pent-up fear. "I told you that all this protection, this coddling, would lead to this. He needs to learn to be more normal. Look at him now, expelled, and because of some stupid thing, some equation." The ensuing argument was not about astrophysics. It was about years of denial, about Stefan's deep fear that his son would never find his place in the world. Elena defended Michael tooth and nail, trying to explain that it wasn't a question of normality, but of integrity. The gulf that had always existed between father and son now seemed like a geological fault, deep and unbridgeable, splitting the family in two. Meanwhile, the university, like an organism protecting itself, began to act in the shadows. There was no official statement but a subtle and poisonous campaign of misinformation. Professor Vance, with his aura of wronged victim, began painting Michael in hallway conversations and emails to colleagues as a disruptive, arrogant, and socially inadequate student. The narrative, like a plague, spread across campus. Students who had once admired Michael's intelligence now looked at him with suspicion and even a certain contempt. In a matter of days, he went from eccentric genius to pariah, to a problem that needed to be contained. There were no cape and cursor villains in this story. There was no absolute evil. There were only ordinary people, making choices based on their own fears, their wounded pride, and their convenience. There was the dean, terrified of a scandal that would tarnish the university's reputation. There was the professor, an older man, terrified of his own irrelevance, of being surpassed. And there was the father, terrified for the future of a son he loved but couldn't understand. And at the very center of this hurricane of human emotions was Michael, fighting not only against a powerful institution, but against the distorted perception that the world and even his own family had of him. Amid the crowd of 200 students in that amphitheater was a young woman named Anya. She wasn't a close friend of Michael's. In fact, they rarely spoke to each other. But she sat near him in several physics classes and always marveled silently at the way he saw things that went unnoticed by everyone else. He didn't just learn. He connected ideas in ways that seemed almost magical. Anya saw what happened in Professor Vance's class. She saw the raised hand, the polite correction, and she saw the disproportionate rage on the professor's face. And something inside her stirred. She tasted the bitter taste of injustice. In the days that followed, she heard the whispers in the hallways. She heard the story being twisted and distorted until Michael became the villain of the narrative. She heard him being called arrogant, disrespectful, problematic, and the injustice she felt at first turned into an indignation that consumed her from within. It wasn't right. It just wasn't right. One gray afternoon, driven by a surge of courage that even she didn't quite understand, Anya found Michael's address in the university system and went to his house. Michael was visibly surprised to see her standing at his door, expecting perhaps another look of pity or accusation. But Anya didn't come with words of comfort. She came with a direct request. "Michael," she said, looking him in the eyes, "I was there. I saw what happened, and I don't believe what they're saying. Can you explain it to me again? The equation. I recorded the entire lecture. I want to understand what really happened." They sat down in the living room, and for the first time in weeks, a different gleam appeared in Michael's eyes. He didn't need to defend himself, just explain. He picked up a notebook and, with a passion that had been stifled for days, began to draw the calculations, explaining not only the professor's crass mistake, but the beauty and elegance of the correct theory. His voice was not angry, but that of a born teacher, someone who deeply loved what he was saying. Anya, with her cell phone, recorded everything. It was not an outburst. It was a lesson. A crystal clear, concise, and irrefutable lesson. At the end, when the explanation was over, she asked a single, simple question. "And that's why they expelled you?" Michael just nodded, a small gesture that carried the weight of the world. That night, Anya didn't sleep. She spent hours editing a simple but devastatingly powerful video. On one side of the screen, she placed the original audio from the lecture, Professor Vance's pompous voice presenting the wrong equation. On the other side, she placed the video she had recorded, with Michael's clear and passionate explanation. And for the coup de grace, she inserted a close-up image of the expulsion letter next to Michael's notebook. She posted the video on social media with a short, direct caption: "My classmate was expelled. For this. University. Please explain." Then she turned off her computer and went to bed, completely unaware of the perfect storm she had just unleashed in the digital world. The internet woke up long before Anya did. The video, posted in the dead of night, began to spread like wildfire. First, it was shared by physics and engineering students at the university, outraged by the professor's gross error and the absurd punishment of the student. Then the wider academic community picked up on it. Renowned physicists, astronomers, and mathematicians from other institutions began to comment, validating Michael's correction and condemning the university's attitude. In a matter of hours, the video jumped from the academic niche to the general public. Journalists, digital influencers, activists. The hashtag #JusticeForMichael exploded, rising to become a global trending topic. People watching the video did not see an arrogant or disruptive student. They saw a brilliant young man, passionate about science, being crushed by an archaic and vain system. Michael's phone, which had been silent, began to ring non-stop. It was local news channels, then national ones, wanting an interview. The university, which days earlier had felt in complete control of the narrative, now watched helplessly as its reputation was dismantled in real time for the whole world to see. The first small but hugely significant victory was an internal email from the president that was leaked to the press. In it, the president frantically called for an emergency board meeting to discuss the Vance incident. The second victory came when Professor Vance himself, unable to withstand the avalanche of criticism and exposure of his mistake, deactivated all his social media accounts and disappeared from public life. But the third victory, the sweetest and most transformative for Michael, did not come from the media or the administration. It came from within his own home. That night, his father, Stefan, walked into his room, cell phone in hand. He didn't yell. He didn't blame him. He just sat down next to him on the bed, showed him the screen with the video that had already racked up millions of views, and with a broken voice and eyes filled with regret he could no longer hide, he said, I watched it several times. I understand now, son. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." At that moment, it wasn't about winning a battle against the university. It was about a father finally seeing his son for who he really was, It wasn't a complete victory, not yet, but it was the first powerful glimmers of light in a darkness that, until then, had seemed absolute and insurmountable. Amidst the whirlwind of going viral, a strange calm settled over Michael. The public attention was actually uncomfortable. The camera lights now camped in front of his house were overwhelming, the requests for interviews exhausting. He didn't feel like a hero, a champion of justice, as many portrayed him. He was just Michael. But something fundamental had changed, not around him, but within him. All his life he had lived with the uncomfortable feeling that he needed to apologize for who he was. From childhood, he had learned to mask his intense interests, to suppress his keen perceptions, to try to imitate the normal behavior of others, so as not to upset them, to fit in. It was a constant effort, a daily performance that left him exhausted. And now, in a way he could never have imagined, the world was applauding exactly what he had always tried so hard to hide: his relentless logic, his brutal honesty, his obsessive passion for the truth. He began to reflect on the irony of it all. The expulsion, the most painful and humiliating act of his life, turned out to be his liberation. It freed him from the crushing pressure of trying to please a system that, deep down, never valued him for who he was. He understood, with a clarity that only pain can teach, that the real arrogance was not in his act of correcting a mistake. The arrogance was in Professor Vance's refusal to learn, in putting his fragile ego above knowledge. The arrogance was in the university, which placed its corporate image above justice and truth. His mind, which he so often saw as a prison of rigid standards and extreme sensitivities, was in fact his greatest strength, his superpower. He realized that he didn't have to bend and break to fit into the small, tight boxes that the world insisted on creating. The world needed to broaden, to expand, to include and celebrate minds like his. Acceptance, true and deep acceptance, did not come from the applause of millions of strangers on the internet. It sprang from within, silent and powerful. The moment he looked at himself and recognized that his way of seeing, feeling, and processing the world was not wrong. It was just his. And that difference was not a flaw. It was valuable. The university, cornered by an avalanche of public pressure, the threat of losing, millionaire donors, and with its academic credibility in tatters, had no choice but to capitulate. The president, the same man with the polished smile, appeared at a press conference with a grave expression and a carefully crafted speech. Michael's expulsion had, in his words, been reevaluated and revoked. Professor Alistair Vance was placed on indefinite sabbatical leave, an elegant euphemism for forced removal. And, as a gesture to clean up its tarnished image, the university announced, with great fanfare, the creation of a new and robust diversity and inclusion committee, with a specific and unprecedented focus on neurodiversity on campus. It was a victory, a public, undeniable, resounding victory. Michael was invited back, not as a forgiven student but as a symbol. But real life is more complicated than a newspaper headline. The scars from that battle remained. Returning to that campus, to those classrooms, would not be easy. He knew that some of the looks from professors and classmates would still be resentful, that the label of problem student would take time to fade completely. The pain of the initial humiliation, the poison of mistrust, and most of all, the painful conflict with his father, did not magically disappear with a public apology. The truth was that Michael's struggle was not over. It had only changed. But now he had weapons he had never had before. He had a voice, and now he knew how powerful it could be. He had a supportive community that stretched across the globe. And most important of all, he had a self-confidence forged in fire, an unshakable certainty of his own worth. Happiness, he discovered, was not the total absence of problems, but the deep conviction that he was capable of facing them. The journey would still be long, but for the first time in his life, he no longer felt alone on it. He and his father, Stefan, began attending a support group for families, learning, awkwardly at first, a new language for connecting, based on patience and acceptance. Elena, his mother, discovered a new calling in herself, becoming a vocal and relentless advocate for other neurodivergent students facing silent battles. The crisis was not just overcome. It broke them down and rebuilt them into something stronger, more aware and more united. The truth sometimes does not whisper, it echoes. And when an authentic and true voice finally finds its echo, it has the power to tear down the highest walls, those built with bricks of pride and cement of fear. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you think, feel outraged, please like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your interaction is what makes messages like this travel further and reach more hearts. And subscribe to the channel so that together we can continue to give voice to stories that desperately need to be told. Someone, somewhere in the world, may really need to hear this today.